What if I told you that everything you believed about the Victorian era is untrue? We imagine this time as an era of strictness, elegance, and unshakable moral principles, a true golden age of the British Empire. But behind the polished facade of ballrooms and lace dresses lay a world of double standards and carefully guarded secrets. It was an era when reputation was more valuable than life itself, and one careless word could ruin a person's fate, especially if you were a woman. Society demanded that women be angels, but deprived them of almost all their rights, turning them into beautiful possessions of their fathers and husbands. And when these angels dared to have their own desires, or even worse, tried to fight for themselves, the system came down on them with all its might. Their stories turned into high-profile scandals that newspapers relished on their front pages, while society tried with all its might to hide and forget them. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how an ordinary divorce could turn into a national disgrace, and what tool was more terrifying than any prison for an undesirable wife. What lies behind the beautiful picture of the Victorian ideal is a carefully constructed cage. The main myth of the era was the image of the angel in the house, the ideal woman, wife, and mother. This term, coined by the poet Coventry Patmore, described a woman who was passive, submissive, and completely devoted to her family and home. This ideal was replicated in books, magazines, and sermons, becoming the main guideline for middle and upper-class girls. From childhood, they were taught to suppress their desires, opinions, and ambitions. The main goal of their lives was a successful marriage, after which they completely dissolved into the shadow of their husbands. The angel in the house was not supposed to have her own thoughts beyond the scope of household chores. Politics, science, art, all of these were considered strictly male territory. A woman who showed interest in these areas risked being labeled a blue stocking and facing public condemnation. In public, she was her husband's adornment, silent and beautiful. At home, she was his faithful servant, managing the household and raising children. Her world was confined to the walls of her home, which turned from a cozy nest into a gilded prison. Any deviation from this image was considered not just bad form, but a sign of moral decay. Emotionality, passion, and the desire for independence were all equated with an illness that needed to be treated. And the methods of treatment were sometimes truly shocking. This image was convenient for men, as it completely subjugated women to their will. It gave the husband absolute power over his wife, her body, her property, and even her thoughts. She was his property, and the law fully supported this. However, behind the facade of this ideal lay suppressed desires and broken destinies. Women locked into this role suffered from depression and despair, but they could not complain. That would mean acknowledging the imperfection of the sacred institution of marriage. This myth created enormous tension between public duty and personal feelings. Women lived in constant fear of making a mistake, saying the wrong word, or giving the wrong look. The price of such a mistake was catastrophic. Thus, Victorian society created a time bomb. It demanded the impossible from women, to be human beings but without human desires. And when this bomb exploded, scandal was inevitable. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. What do you think about this ideal of womanhood, and could it exist in today's world? Let me know in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about how powerless married women were in the Victorian era? From a legal standpoint, when a woman got married, she effectively ceased to exist as an individual. This legal principle, known as the doctrine of concealment, meant that a wife's identity was completely absorbed by her husband's. After the wedding, all property owned by the woman automatically became the property of her spouse. Whether it was money, land, or jewelry, she no longer had any rights to it. Even the money she earned belonged to her husband by law. She could not enter into contracts, go to court, or own property in her own name. Her husband gained complete control over her finances and could dispose of them as he saw fit. The woman became an eternal child, completely dependent on the will of her spouse. Even children born in wedlock were considered the property of their father by law. In the event of divorce or separation, the mother had no rights to them. The husband could forbid her from seeing her children, and the law would be on his side. Divorce was an extremely difficult, expensive, and humiliating procedure, available only to a few. For a man, a single breach of marital fidelity on the part of his wife was grounds for divorce. A woman, on the other hand, had to prove not only this, but also the existence of aggravating circumstances. The divorce procedure was a public disgrace, especially for women. All the details of her personal life were brought to public attention and relished in the newspapers. Even if the divorce was successful, the woman became an outcast in society. But what happened when a woman decided to challenge this system? In the next chapter, we will delve into one of the most sensational scandals of the era, which exposed the rottenness of Victorian marriage. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of Victorian high society. In 1886, England was rocked by a divorce case that became a symbol of the double standards of the era. It was the case of Sir Charles Crawford and his young wife Virginia, a scandal that was discussed by everyone from aristocrats in their clubs to maids in the kitchen. Sir Charles was a well-known politician and socialite, a man with an impeccable public reputation. Lady Virginia was a beautiful and educated woman from a good family. Their marriage seemed perfect, the embodiment of the Victorian dream. But behind closed doors, everything was different. Sir Charles led a double life full of intrigue and dubious relationships. At the same time, he demanded absolute purity and obedience from his wife, in keeping with the image of an angel in the house. When Lady Virginia, tired of her husband's behavior, decided to demand separate living arrangements, Sir Charles struck back. He accused her of marital infidelity with another well-known politician, Lord Dilke. It was tantamount to a social atomic bomb. A trial began, which turned into a real circus. Newspapers published transcripts of the hearings, full of juicy details. The whole country watched with bated breath as the dirty laundry of one of the kingdom's most famous couples was aired in public. The main problem was that the evidence against Lady Virginia was circumstantial and based on hearsay. However, in a Victorian court, this was sufficient. The word of a man, especially an aristocrat, carried much more weight than any excuses a woman might offer. Sir Charles himself, whose own escapades were an open secret, appeared in court as the offended and virtuous spouse. Society and the court willingly accepted this charade. He was forgiven for what his wife was so vehemently accused of. In the end, Lady Virginia lost the case. Her reputation was destroyed. Her name became synonymous with vice. She lost everything: her position in society, her friends, and, most importantly, the right to see her daughter. This scandal vividly demonstrated the monstrous hypocrisy of Victorian morality. Men were allowed everything, women nothing. The court was not a place to seek the truth, but an instrument to punish a woman who dared to go against her husband's will. Lady Crawford's story became a warning to other women. It showed that even a member of high society was completely defenseless against the system. Her tragedy was the price she paid for trying to gain her freedom. Guess what happened next to Lady Crawford's reputation? The court handed down its verdict, but the real execution took place in the pages of newspapers. In the Victorian era, the press was flourishing, and nothing boosted circulation like a good scandal, especially one involving high society. Divorce proceedings, which had previously been private, became public. Reporters sat in the courtroom and carefully recorded every word. The very next day, the juiciest details were available to anyone who could buy a newspaper. For a woman involved in a scandal, it was pure torture. Her name, her actions, her appearance, everything was subject to public discussion and condemnation. Journalists did not mince words, portraying her as a fallen woman and a destroyer of family values. At the same time, the press was much more lenient towards men involved in the same scandals. Their behavior was often described as a forgivable weakness or even something self-evident. All the blame was automatically placed on the woman. Newspapers created a certain narrative, shaping public opinion. They did not simply report the facts, but interpreted them, always in favor of patriarchal morality. A woman in a scandal was considered guilty a priori, and it was practically impossible for her to justify herself. Not only reports from the courtroom were published, but also caricatures. These drawings depicted the woman in a humiliating and grotesque manner. It was a powerful weapon that destroyed what remained of her reputation. This persecution in the press had real consequences. Everyone turned away from the woman whose name was involved in the scandal. She could not appear in public. She was not accepted in respectable homes. But what was the price of this notoriety? In the next chapter, you will learn about an invisible prison that was more terrifying than any real one. For a Victorian woman, especially one from the upper classes, society was everything. Her status, her social circle, her future, everything depended on her position in this closed world. To lose one's reputation meant to lose everything. It was true social death. A woman caught violating moral norms became an outcast. The doors of houses that had been hospitably open yesterday were now tightly closed. Yesterday's friends pretended not to notice her on the street. She was excluded from all the guest lists for balls, receptions, and dinner parties. She could no longer participate in the social life that was the essence of her existence. She became invisible, as if she had been erased from life. It was not just unpleasant, it was catastrophic. The woman was deprived not only of entertainment, but also of her entire social support system. She remained in complete isolation, alone with her shame. Even her own family often turned away from her so as not to tarnish their reputation. Her parents could forbid her from crossing the threshold of her family home. Her brothers and sisters would cease all communication with her. Such a woman could not hope to remarry. No man in her circle would risk tying his life to someone whose name had been tarnished. Her future was completely ruined. If she had children, they too faced an unenviable fate. The mother's shame cast a shadow over the entire family. It was difficult for daughters to find a good match, and for sons to pursue a career. This was how Victorian society punished those who dared to break its rules. It did not resort to physical violence, but its methods were no less cruel. It simply pretended that you no longer existed. This is what happens behind closed doors when a husband wants to get rid of his wife. If social ostracism was an informal punishment, there was also a completely official, legal way to silence an undesirable woman. That way was a psychiatric hospital. In the Victorian era, legislation on the mentally ill was extremely flawed. To have a person committed to a hospital, all it took was the signatures of 2 doctors, and finding 2 compliant doctors for a certain fee was not that difficult. For a husband who wanted to get rid of a tiresome, stubborn, or simply wealthy wife, it was the perfect tool. He could declare her insane, and society would readily believe him. After all, any woman who went against her husband's will was already considered not quite normal. The diagnoses were very vague and convenient. Hysteria, moral insanity, melancholy. These definitions could be applied to any behavior that did not fit into the framework of Victorian decency. Reading too much, arguing with her husband, refusing to fulfill her marital duties. All of this could be symptoms of mental illness. Once in the hospital, a woman was trapped. All her protests and attempts to prove her sanity only reinforced the doctor's diagnosis. After all, violent behavior was a clear sign of insanity. Conditions in such institutions were often appalling. Patients were kept in locked rooms, restricted in their movements, and subjected to questionable treatment methods. It was more like a prison than a hospital. It was almost impossible to leave such an institution. Only a husband could take his wife back, and if he was the one who had initiated her confinement, he certainly did not do so. The woman was doomed to spend the rest of her life within the walls of the asylum. But what was being treated in these institutions? In the next chapter, we will look at the shocking methods of healing women's souls. The diagnosis of female hysteria was a real panacea for Victorian doctors. It covered everything from depression and anxiety to simple disobedience to one's husband. And the methods of treating this ailment were no less surprising than the diagnosis itself. One of the most popular methods was the so-called treatment by rest, developed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. This method was intended for women of high society. It consisted of complete isolation and absolute physical rest. The patient was placed in a separate room, often with the windows curtained. She was forbidden to get out of bed, read, write, or even feed herself. Any mental or physical activity was strictly prohibited. It was believed that such isolation and inactivity would calm the woman's frayed nerves. In reality, it was a form of sophisticated psychological torture. Women locked within 4 walls and deprived of any activity slowly went mad from boredom and loneliness. Another important component of the treatment was a special diet. Patients were force-fed fatty and high-calorie foods to make them gain weight. It was believed that being overweight contributed to women's health and peace of mind. Sometimes more radical methods were used. For example, hydrotherapy, which consisted of pouring ice water over patients. This was supposed to invigorate the nervous system. In some cases, doctors resorted to surgical intervention. It was believed that hysteria could be caused by problems with the female reproductive organs. This led to unnecessary and mutilating operations. It is noteworthy that men with similar symptoms, which were called neurasthenia, were recommended a completely different treatment. On the contrary, they were prescribed physical exercise, travel, and active pursuits. What was considered a cure for men was poison for women. All these methods were aimed not at curing women, but at breaking their will. The goal was to return them to a state of obedience and passivity prescribed by society. A woman who ceased to cause inconvenience was considered healthy. These therapeutic practices are a striking example of how medicine was used to maintain social order. Under the guise of caring for health, a mechanism of oppression was hidden. Women's bodies and minds became a battlefield on which patriarchal society asserted its power. Behind many Victorian scandals lay not only morality, but also cold economic calculation. Women's financial dependence on men was the cornerstone of the entire system. This dependence was absolute and enshrined in law. As we already know, when a woman married, she lost the right to her property. But even if she was not married, her economic opportunities were extremely limited. For girls from respectable families, there was a very narrow range of professions available. The most respectable occupation was considered to be that of a governess. However, it was hard and thankless work with low pay. A governess lived in someone else's house, was in an ambiguous position between a servant and a member of the family, and was often subjected to humiliation. Other professions, such as nursing or teaching, were also low-paid and not considered prestigious. Working in a factory or shop was the lot of women from the lower classes and was absolutely unthinkable for a lady. The world of law, medicine, or business was closed to women. Thus, the only way for a woman from the middle or upper class to secure a decent existence was through marriage. This turned the search for a husband not into a romantic adventure, but into the main economic task of her life. Her entire future depended on how successful her match would be. This system put women in an extremely vulnerable position. They were forced to marry not for love, but for convenience. And once they found themselves in an unhappy marriage, they could not escape it, as they had no means of support. Men were well aware of this dependence and often took advantage of it. A husband could control his wife by threatening to deprive her of her livelihood. This was a powerful lever of pressure that forced women to endure almost anything. Even if a woman received an inheritance, she could not freely dispose of it. Often, complex legal structures were created that transferred property to the trust management of male relatives. It was believed that women were incapable of managing finances competently. This economic helplessness was the basis of women's subordinate position. It made them dependent, deprived them of freedom of choice, and forced them to hold on to marriage at any cost. That is why scandals related to divorce and inheritance were so high profile. Not only feelings were at stake, but also huge amounts of money. One of the first and most important demands was the right of married women to own property. Activists such as Barbara Beaudechon began a campaign to change the law. They wrote articles, collected signatures for petitions, and gave lectures explaining the absurdity of the existing order. It was a long and difficult struggle. Many men, and even some women, believed that the right to property would destroy the family and undermine the foundations of society. The idea that a wife could have something of her own, separate from her husband, seemed revolutionary and dangerous. Nevertheless, thanks to the persistence of activists, the first Married Women's Property Act was passed in 1870. It was imperfect and gave women only limited rights, but it was a huge breakthrough, the first step toward economic independence. In 1882, a new, more progressive act was passed, which finally recognized married women as having the same rights to property as unmarried women. It was a real revolution. Women ceased to be the economic appendages of their husbands. At the same time, there was a struggle for access to education and professions. Emily Davis founded Girton College, the first higher education institution for women in Cambridge. Sophia Jacques Blake and the Edinburgh Seven fought for women's right to study medicine. These pioneering women faced enormous resistance and ridicule. They were called unfeminine, and attempts were made to prevent them from studying and working. But their persistence paved the way for future generations. High-profile divorce cases also played a role. They clearly demonstrated to society the injustice of divorce and child custody laws. This led to a gradual softening of legislation in favor of women. This was only the beginning of a long journey. True equality was still a long way off, but it was during the Victorian era that the foundations of modern feminism were laid. Women whose names were associated with scandals often unwittingly became catalysts for change. Their personal tragedies highlighted the flaws in the system. They were victims, but their sacrifices were not in vain. The Victorian era is now a thing of the past, leaving behind a complex and contradictory legacy. We admire its art, architecture, and scientific achievements. But we must also remember its dark side, the hypocrisy and injustice that prevailed in society. The scandals that were so carefully concealed are now an important historical source. They allow us to look behind the facade and see the real lives of the people of that time. They tell the stories of those whose voices were silenced. The stories of Lady Crawford and many other women are not just juicy anecdotes from the past. They are documents that testify to systematic oppression. They show the price women paid for every step toward freedom and equality. The double standards that were so evident in these scandals have not completely disappeared. Society still tends to judge women more harshly than men. The fight against this hypocrisy continues today. The laws have changed, and modern women have rights that the Victorian angel in the home could not have dreamed of. They can own property, get an education, build a career, and dissolve a marriage. But the path to these changes was paved with the suffering and broken lives of their predecessors. Studying these scandals teaches us to be critical of any social norms and ideals. It shows that behind beautiful words about morality and tradition often lies the desire of one group of people to control another, and that any system based on inequality sooner or later breeds conflict. The Victorian era has left us with an important lesson. A society that requires half of its members to be silent angels is doomed to scandals and internal contradictions. The true strength of society lies not in rigid frameworks, but in freedom and equality for all. The memory of these women, their struggles, and their tragedies is part of our shared history. They were not just victims, but unwilling fighters for a better future, and their stories must be told. We see that behind every great achievement of the era, there were not only triumphs, but also quiet dramas. The price of progress was often measured not only in pounds sterling, but also in human destinies. And it is important to remember this. We have lifted the veil on the carefully guarded secrets of the Victorian era. We have seen that behind the glitz and austerity lay double standards, injustice, and broken women's lives. The scandals we have examined are not just stories. They are symptoms of a sick society built on hypocrisy. Despite their tragedy, these events became catalysts for change. They forced society to look at itself in the mirror and be horrified. It was from the ashes of these scandals that the women's rights movement was born, which changed the world. What other secrets and scandals from the past would you like to uncover? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new investigations.